Okay, settle in because we are about to take a deep dive into some seriously complex waters today.
Hmm.
We're tackling a thinker whose name often evokes either, well, profound respect or maybe just utter bewilderment. Jacques Lacan.
Right, he's definitely got that reputation.
He's known for being incredibly dense, sometimes almost impenetrable, yet his influence across psychoanalysis, philosophy, lit crit,
Hmm.
even cultural studies, it's undeniable.
That's right. His work is challenging, no doubt about it. Reading Lacan can feel like trying to navigate a hall of mirrors, confusing, disorienting, often, frustrating.
Definitely.
His style is frequently deliberate in its difficulty, playing with language in ways that resist easy summary. But the payoff, if you can sort of follow the thread, is a remarkably powerful and insightful framework for understanding what it truly means to be a human subject, how language fundamentally shapes us, and, well, what drives us beneath the surface of conscious thought.
Exactly. And that's our mission today. We have a stack of source material articles, excerpts, commentary provided by one of you, the listeners,
Great stuff, by the way.
and we're going to unpack it together. Our goal is to extract the absolute core themes, his overall approach, and, crucially, make it intelligible.
Yeah, to try and cut through some of that density.
We want to give you a shortcut, maybe, to understanding Lacan, guided by what these sources highlight as most important. Just enough insight and context to make sense of these profound, sometimes unsettling, ideas.
Think of this as navigating a complex intellectual landscape with a curated map. We'll highlight the essential nuggets, explain the key terms as we encounter them.
And we will encounter some key terms.
Oh, yes. And we'll connect these abstract concepts to ideas and examples drawn directly from the source material we have here. The promise is clarity and insight, aiming to demystify concepts that continue to profoundly shape our understanding of ourselves, our relationships, and really the very fabric of reality as we experience it through language.
So let's jump right in. Where does Lacan even fit? Especially in relation to psychoanalysis, because he wasn't just some random academic, right? He was steeped in Freud, but also, well, pretty critical.
Absolutely. What's fascinating right from the start is that Lacan didn't see his work as inventing something entirely new. Instead, he framed it fundamentally as a return to Freud,
A return, okay.
a return to the fundamental insights of Sigmund Freud. He believed that the psychoanalytic establishment that followed Freud had somehow lost its way, maybe diluting or misunderstanding some of Freud's most radical and unsettling discoveries.
Like what, specifically?
Well, Lacan wanted to go back to the foundational texts, like the interpretation of dreams, and clarify, extend, and re-emphasize what he saw as Freud's own implicit understanding of language, logic, even dialectics in the workings of the unconscious.
Right, so he saw Freud himself as already grappling with the structure and logic of language. Our source material points this out, noting Freud's own work is full of references to philology, the study of language in historical texts, his logical inferences, and even that kind of dialectical thinking, where ideas develop through conflict.
Precisely. Freud was working with the tools available to him at the time, and Lacan felt that the rise of modern linguistics, well, it provided the missing piece, the theoretical rigor Freud perhaps lacked.
Okay.
And one crucial point Lacan made, highlighted in the sources, is how important Freudian distinctions got blurred, especially in translation.
Ah, the translation issue. Always tricky.
Extremely. A classic example is the difference between the German terms tribe and instinct. Freud used Trieblacan, rendered it in French as pulsion or drive,
Right.
to mean a psychical force, something rooted in the mind and body, but different from a purely biological urge like instinct or instinct.
Right. Drive versus instinct.
But the English translation often just rendered both as instinct. And Lacan argued this lost a vital distinction, reducing psychoanalysis to something more biological than Freud intended. This kind of terminological precision is absolutely central to Lacan's project. Words matter enormously because, for him, they structure our reality.
Okay, so he wanted to purify Freud, get back to the source, apply these new linguistic tools, but this wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms by the psychoanalytic establishment, was it?
No,
Oh.
far from it.
This is where things get a bit dramatic, right? In the history books.
Very much so. Lacan's career was marked by significant conflict and rupture within the established psychoanalytic community, both in France and internationally. The sources detail this history quite vividly.
Where did it start?
It really kicked off with the split from the dominant Société Psychanalytique de Paris, the SPP, back in the 1950s. And this wasn't just theoretical nitpicking.
No.
It involved really practical issues, like how long analytic sessions should be. Lacan famously experimented with variable length sessions.
These short sessions, yeah.
Which was seen as a really radical departure. And he was critical of what he saw as the medicalization of psychoanalysis, reducing it to just a therapeutic technique rather than a fundamental inquiry into the human condition.
So that led to a new group.
Yes, the formation of the Société Française de Psychanalyse, the SFP.
But even the SFP didn't quite make it into the international fold, did they? Our sources mention this crucial moment in 1963.
That's right. The International Psychoanalytical Association, the IPA, ultimately rejected the SFP's request for recognition. This was a major blow.
Effectively kicking Lacan and his followers out of the mainstream psychoanalytic world.
Pretty much. And the sources are quite clear about the reasons cited. It wasn't just about technical issues like session length or training protocols, although those were part of it.
What else?
The IPA report, mentioned in our material, also cited incompatibilities of personalities.
The personal element.
Always there, isn't it? There's a particularly poignant reference in the source material from Lacan's television seminar to the insane behavior of certain key figures, people like Nock and Benassi.
The Burgraves.
Exactly. Lacan called them the Burgraves of analysis, basically. The old guard, who, in his view, seemed more concerned with preserving their authority and institutional power than with the radical insights of psychoanalysis or, frankly, the effective training of new analysts.
So it was academic, theoretical, and deeply personal and political.
Wow.
It was a real schism. And this institutional conflict, this effective expulsion, led Lacan to found his own school, the École Freudienne de Paris, the EFP. And crucially, it led him to move his hugely influential public seminar.
Right, the seminar. That was a big deal.
Yes, that move is key. He moved his seminar from the Sainte-Anne Psychiatric Hospital, where it had been drawing mostly clinicians and students, to the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, the ENS.
And our source notes that this move had a massive impact. It brought him a completely new audience, right? A wider intellectual crowd.
Exactly. Philosophers, linguists, literary theorists, even mathematicians started showing up. This really helped spread psychoanalytic ideas beyond the clinical world and right into the mainstream of Parisian intellectual life. It fundamentally shaped post-structuralist thought.
So it broadened the conversation, brought in new perspectives? Absolutely. It exposed his ideas to thinkers who could help him refine and push them further. Which brings us neatly to the intellectual foundations that shaped Lacan's unique approach, the influences beyond just his intense rereading of Freud.
And as we mentioned, modern linguistics was absolutely crucial.
Fundamental. So Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jakobson weren't just interesting side notes. They provided the very tools Lacan felt Freud needed, or perhaps had intuited but couldn't fully articulate.
How so?
Well, Lacan felt that Freud, while understanding the importance of language in dreams, symptoms, slips of the tongue, he lacked a rigorous structural way of understanding how language operates at a fundamental level and how it structures the unconscious itself.
Okay.
Saussure provided the basic model, the linguistic sign, split into the signifier, the sound image, the word, and the concept it refers to.
Signifier, signified, got it.
Jakobson, working within structural linguistics, provided the understanding of how language operates through fundamental functions. Combination, putting words together in sequence like sentences, and substitution, swapping one word or element for another.
Metaphor and metonymy, essentially. We'll get to those, I assume.
We definitely will. And this all fits into the broader context of structuralism, which looks for underlying structures in language, myths, societies. Our sources mention its roots in Russia.
So that structuralist perspective is key to understanding how Lacan sees the unconscious, not as chaos, but as having a structure.
Precisely, a set of rules and relationships, like a language. And the sources also highlight broader philosophical and even anthropological influences.
Like who?
Hegel, definitely. Particularly the master-slave dialectic, which echoes in Lacan's ideas about demand and recognition and maybe the concept of Affabung, that idea of negating but also preserving something. Pascal gets mentioned. His famous line, "You would not be looking for me if you had not already found me," is used to illustrate a complex point about the subject and desire. Plato, referenced in relation to reminiscence, even Nietzsche in the context of moralists.
Wow, quite a mix.
And anthropology, too. Mentions of early figures like Lévi-Breuil work on totemism, contrasted with the later structuralist anthropology of Lévi-Strauss, who is actually a contemporary and colleague of Lacan's at the ENS.
It's a real synthesis, isn't it? Not just psychoanalysis, but plugged into this whole network of 20th century European thought.
It really is.
So let's get to the absolute heart of it. The core idea that really defines Lacan's project: language, subjectivity, and the unconscious.
Yes, this is absolutely essential. The foundation upon which, well, pretty much everything else is built. Lacan's starting point, as stated powerfully in the sources, is there is no unconscious except for the speaking being.
Okay, unpack that. No unconscious except for the speaking being.
It means the unconscious isn't some biological basement or a reservoir of pre-verbal feelings. It's something that exists and operates because we are beings immersed in language.
So language isn't just a tool we use.
No, not just a tool we pick up to express thoughts that already exist fully formed inside us. For Lacan, language is an order, a system with its own laws and structures that actually constitutes us as subjects. It shapes our reality, our desires, our very sense of being.
How is that different from, say, animal communication?
Well, the sources are explicit here. Language is fundamentally different from natural expression or signals or codes or mere information transfer, like in computers. Language has something irreducible about it, something symbolic that goes beyond simple communication.
Okay, so the unconscious is tied to language. It's structured by language. You mentioned Saussure earlier, the signifier and the signified. How does Lacan build on that basic model?
Saussure presented the sign as a relatively stable unit, signifier, linked to signified concept of a tree. Lacan takes this and makes it dynamic, unstable. For him, meaning or signification isn't a fixed point. It's an incessant process that happens along a chain of signifiers.
A chain.
Yes, he talks about the signifier chain. Each signifier doesn't just point to a single concept, but insists on meaning by linking to other signifiers. Meaning is constantly deferred, sliding along the chain. He calls it the incessant sliding of the signified under the signifier.
The trying to grasp smoke? Or maybe like words in a poem where each new word changes the meaning of what came before.
That's a good way to put it. Meaning is always in motion, always depends on what comes next in the chain. But obviously language has to function somehow, right? We do communicate.
Right. Otherwise it'd just be chaos.
Exactly. So you need points where meaning stabilizes, even if only momentarily. Lacan calls these anchoring points, or points de
Points for what?
capiton. Like the buttons on upholstery, the source uses that visual analogy.
Ah, okay, like holding the fabric down.
Yes. These points provide temporary nodes of fixity, linking certain signifiers to certain signifieds, anchoring the meaning. They allow for communication, but the underlying tendency is this constant slippage, this dependency on the whole chain.
So the unconscious is structured like this kind of language, this dynamic chain of signifiers with its rules, its slippage, its anchoring points.
Precisely. This is the fundamental connection Lacan makes between linguistics and psychoanalysis. He argues that Freud's descriptions of the primary process, how the unconscious works, especially in dreams and symptoms, outside conscious logic.
Condensation and displacement.
Exactly. Condensation, where several ideas are crammed into one image, corresponds to the linguistic function of metaphor substitution. Displacement, where emotional energy shifts from one idea to another, corresponds to metonymy combination, sliding along the chain.
So Freud was already dealing with linguistic mechanisms without maybe having the formal terms for them?
That's Lacan's argument. He says Freud's royal road to the unconscious in dream analysis was in fact dealing directly with the letter of the discourse, the way signifiers operate according to these linguistic rules.
Okay, so if the unconscious operates like language, what does that do to our idea of the subject? You know, the stable, unified I we usually think we are.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
This leads to a fundamental and maybe quite destabilizing point. Lacan introduces a crucial distinction, drawing on the linguist Émile Benveniste.
Benveniste, right.
Between the statement, and I'll say the actual words you utter, the content, and the enunciation. Enunciation, the act of speaking itself, the position from which you speak.
Okay, statement versus enunciation. Give me an example.
Think about saying, I am hungry. The statement is the content, hungry, and the grammatical subject, I. But the act of saying, I am hungry, involves an I that is speaking now, right here, occupying a certain position. That act, that enunciating I, is different from the I in the sentence itself.
Okay, so there's a split.
Exactly. A fundamental disjunction. The subject of the utterance, the I in the sentence, which seems stable, and the subject of enunciation, the I who is speaking, which is always shifting, always present, but kind of elusive.
And our source mentions Benveniste's work on pronouns like I as shifters. Their meaning changes depending on who's speaking. I means me when I say it, you when you say it.
Precisely. The I in speech isn't a stable, fixed entity inside us. It's a position in language, a function that can be occupied by different aspects of the speaker. The conscious ego or the unconscious subject that pops up and slips in jokes.
And this is where Lacan's famous phrase comes in.
Yes, the core radical idea. I is an other, and the even more precise formulation from the sources. The subject is represented by one signifier to another.
Whoa, okay. So the subject isn't this solid thing outside language, it's produced within language, constantly shifting between different labels, different roles.
Exactly. It's not centered inside us, it's decentered, out there in the linguistic network. The subject isn't the master of language, it's produced by language.
So my sense of self is an effect of language.
In a fundamental way, yes. And this process means that, as our source notes, drawing on Pascal's paradox, speech always subjectively includes its own reply.
What does that mean, includes its own reply?
It uses Pascal's phrase, "You would not be looking for me if you had not already found me." It suggests that the very act of seeking, of speaking, of asking a question is only possible because the structure that allows the question, the symbolic order, the other, has already acted upon you. Your own words contain the trace of the other's response, or the structure that shapes the possible responses.
Okay, this connection between language and the subject, this I is another, the divided subject. It's a lot to wrap your head around. Where does truth fit into this picture then? If the subject is unstable and meaning slides, is there any stable truth?
Lacan has a pretty radical take on truth, tied directly to this view of language. He famously says, borrowing a phrase our sources highlight, "I, the truth, am speaking."
I, the truth, am speaking. What's that supposed to mean?
It means truth isn't some static fact waiting to be discovered objectively. It's not something you can pin down and say, ah, there it is. It's something that whirls and wanders, as the source puts it.
Then where do you see it emerge most clearly?
Not in perfectly formed, conscious statements, but in the cracks, the slips of language, slips of the tongue, jokes, puns, symptoms.
Like Freud's psychopathology of everyday life, right? Where errors reveal hidden meanings. Our source echoes this,
Exactly.
saying every unsuccessful act is a successful discourse because it reveals something hidden. And the lapsus, the slip, is where truth breaks through, the gag that hinges on speech.
Precisely. For Lacan, this Freudian truth, the truth of the unconscious, isn't repressed behind language. It emerges through language in its failures and paradoxes. It's been repressed from conscious knowledge, but re-enters the field of science and practice through psychoanalysis.
And this truth isn't complete.
No, it's fundamentally linked to lack in being, to what it hides, to the fact that there's always something unspoken, something missing. Lacan relates this to castration. Truth isn't found in language like a neat package. It's found upon or from the order of the effects of language. It's what language does.
Okay, that's a huge amount about language and the subject. The unconscious structured like language, the signifier chains, sliding meaning, the divided subject, truth speaking in the gaps. Let's shift gears a bit to another cornerstone, the three orders or registers.
Right. The imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. This is Lacan's way of organizing psychic reality and human experience.
3 dimensions.
Yes, 3 fundamental dimensions or registers. And it's absolutely crucial to understand these aren't just developmental stages you pass through and leave behind.
Oh.
No, they're interacting dimensions present throughout life, constantly influencing each other. They're different ways we structure our experience.
Okay, let's start with the first one, the imaginary. Our sources mention the mirror stage as foundational here.
The mirror stage is absolutely key to understanding the imaginary. It describes a crucial moment in early development, usually between 6 and 18 months.
What happens?
Well, before this, the infant experiences its body as fragmented, kind of chaotic, unruly movements, sensations, no coherent sense of self. Then, the infant sees its image, its total form, its gestalt in a mirror, or maybe reflected in the gaze of another person like the mother.
And the source describes this gestalt, this image, as providing a sense of a whole unified body. But it's an image seen from outside.
Exactly. It gives a sense of anticipated motor control and coordination that the infant doesn't actually have yet. The source uses the great phrase, anticipation from insufficiency.
Anticipation from insufficiency. I like that.
It captures it perfectly. This external image, this unified gestalt, is described as more constituent than constituted. It's forming the infant's sense of self, even though it's external. It appears with a contrasting size, bigger, more coherent than the felt internal chaos, and a symmetry that inverts the infant's felt turbulent movement.
So it's powerful, this image. It symbolizes the mental permanence of the I.
Yes, it gives the infant its first durable sense of itself as distinct whole. But, and this is crucial, the source also says it prefigures the subject's alienating destination.
Alienating. Why is getting a sense of yourself alienating?
Because this initial, crucial sense of self is assumed from an external image. The identity is constructed like another, based on something seen outside oneself. It's a moment of fundamental identification with an external form.
Like looking in the mirror and saying, ah, that's me.
Sort of, yes. Our source even links this to comparative psychology, mentioning Kohler's work with chimps and the aha alebnis, that sudden moment of recognition. Here, it's recognizing your own image.
So the ego emerges from this moment, this fascination and identification with the image.
Precisely. The ego, for Lacan, is primarily an imaginary function. It's formed by and takes its shape from images, especially this initial unified body image, and the ego's primary role throughout life.
To maintain that illusion.
Exactly. To maintain this illusion of wholeness, coherence, and mastery that was first provided by that mirror image.
So the ego's function is one of misrecognition, or reconnaissance, as the French term goes. It refuses to accept the fundamental fragmentation and alienation of the subject we talked about earlier.
You got it. The ego is the part of us that wants to feel in control, unified, autonomous. But this is fundamentally an illusion based on identifying with an external image. This is why Lacan differentiates anti-speech, which is tied to the ego's illusory coherence and control, from full speech, which is closer to the subject's truth as constituted in the unconscious of the symbolic order, a truth that often looks fragmented or contradictory from the ego's viewpoint.
And the imaginary is also strongly linked to aggressivity.
Yes, this comes directly from the source material. Aggressivity is presented as both intended aggression and, crucially, as an image of corporal dislocation.
How does that work?
Well, while the mirror image provides unity, it also immediately becomes a source of rivalry. Other people also present unified images, right? And these images become rivals for that ideal self seen in the mirror.
So it's like, that person looks whole and complete, just like my ideal image. They're a threat.
Kind of. This fundamental rivalry in the imaginary, this competition based on images, is the root of aggressivity. Projecting this narcissistic image onto others, seeing them as threats or rivals to one's own imagined wholeness, can tinge the world with hostility.
And the source links negative transference and analysis to this.
Right. The initial resistance or hostility towards the analyst is often linked to this imaginary transference of archaic images and rivalries from the mirror stage.
Okay, that's the imaginary images. The ego, misrecognition, rivalry, aggressivity. The realm of appearances and identification. Let's move to the symbolic order.
Right. The symbolic order is utterly distinct. This is the realm of language, law, culture, social structures, rules, kinship systems. This is the order that truly constitutes the speaking subject, that imposes structure and meaning.
So, if the imaginary is about dual relationships, self and image, self and rival, the symbolic is different.
Yes, the symbolic introduces a third term, the signifier, the law, the name of the Father. It creates the network of relationships that defines our social world.
And this is where the famously complex relationship between need, demand, and desire comes in, right?
Absolutely. This triad is a key concept developed within the symbolic. Needs are biological: hunger, thirst, warmth. Any living creature has needs.
But for humans.
For a speaking being, needs get caught up in language and social relations. When an infant cries or when you ask for something, that basic need is transformed into a demand.
A demand addressed to the other.
Exactly. As the source puts it powerfully, all speech is demand, addressed to the other, initially the mother, later the whole social order.
So saying I'm hungry isn't just stating a fact, it's a demand.
Yes, and the response you get, food, care, attention, words, is received not just as satisfaction of the need, but also as a response to the appeal, as a gift, a token of love or recognition. Lacan argues, and the source highlights, that there's no adequation between the need and the demand that conveys it. The demand is always more than the need.
And desire emerges in that gap between the need and the demand.
Precisely. Desire is constituted in this gap. It's what remains unsatisfied even when the need is met.
Can you give an example?
Think about the infant crying for milk, need. In demanding it, they're also implicitly demanding the mother's presence, love, attention, demand. Even when the milk is provided, if the mother is cold or absent, the infant might remain fundamentally unsatisfied. The milk doesn't satisfy the demand for love. Desire is what's left over.
So desire can never be fully satisfied by any object that meets a need.
Exactly. It's a perpetual effect of symbolic articulation. It's not like an animal appetite that can be sated. It's singular, eccentric, meaning not centered on a specific biological object, and fundamentally insatiable. It's linked, the source points out, not to the object that satisfies need, like milk, but the object that causes desire. The elusive objet petit we'll get to later, which is tied to the other's desire.
The source gives a powerful description of how demand functions here, almost crushing the original need.
It does. Demand, by turning need into an appeal for a sign of love, annuls the particularity of the need satisfaction. The milk, the warmth, the care they get, reduced to the level of being no more than the crushing of the demand for love.
Like the other saying, here, take the food, but don't bother me with your deeper appeal.
Exactly. This is perfectly apparent in the psychology of child rearing, as the source notes. Fulfilling a child's physical need often substitutes for, or gets tangled up with, the demand for affection and recognition.
So the specific satisfaction becomes secondary to this search for proof of love.
Right. And the particularity of the need, which seemed lost in the demand for love, reappears beyond demand as an absolute condition, and that is desire. Desire is the difference that results from the subtraction of need from demand. It's a fundamental splitting, spulton, in the subject.
And demand evokes a want to be.
Yes, a desire to be the object of the other's love. This manifests under figures like the nothingness that underlies the demand for love, the fear of being nothing without it, or hate when the demand isn't met, or the unspeakable element that's ignored in the request.
This is incredibly nuanced. Let's talk about another crucial symbolic concept, the name of the father and castration.
Right. The name of the father is a fundamental signifier within the symbolic order. It's not necessarily about the literal father, but rather the paternal function. It introduces the law, the prohibition, which breaks the early, intense, often suffocating imaginary fusion between infant and mother. It structures desire by mediating the child's relationship with the mother.
So it's linked to the Oedipus complex.
Yes, which the source calls a constituent presence in every personal history. It's the stage where the child navigates that triangular relationship with parents and enters the world of social rules.
And the sources make a point about the castration complex itself.
Yes, they're specific.
Ja.
While the myth of the father's murder might be symbolic, the castration complex, the threat or fear of loss, is presented as not a myth.
Okay.
It's a major force, a normative phase of the assumption by the subject of his own sex. It's related to the imaginary function of the phallus in both sexes, not the organ, but the symbolic significance of having or not having what the other desires. The paternal metaphor, the name of the father as signifier, evokes signification and conditions paternity, literal and symbolic.
What about primordial foreclosure for Verwarfung? The sources link it to the Schreber case.
Foreclosure is key, especially for psychosis. It's different from repression. In repression, something is pushed into the unconscious. In foreclosure, Verwarfung, rejection, repudiation.
Yeah.
A fundamental signifier, like the name of the father, isn't repressed, but rejected entirely from the symbolic order early on. The person never fully enters the world structured by paternal law and language in the typical way.
What are the consequences?
Profound consequences for their relationship with reality and language. It often leads to delusions or hallucinations that fill the gap left by the foreclosed signifier. The Schreber case, Daniel Paul Schreber's memoir of his paranoia, is used extensively by Lacan and our sources to illustrate foreclosure.
And other concepts too, right?
Yes, like how a homosexual position might condition the grandiosity and delusion, or the experience of metamorphosis. The source makes a striking, almost poetic link to Schreber's father's strict methods, the Schrebergarten, Lotmont Gardens, and piercing de père en part, a French wordplay on father and part.
The superego also fits in here.
Yes, the Lacanian superego often emerges from a broken link of the symbolic chain, where the name of the father is unstable. It can manifest as an obscene, ferocious figure, a cruel, irrational command demanding impossible obedience. It's that harsh, paradoxical command to enjoy, Jewy, in a way that's impossible, leading to guilt.
And then there's the phallus, another big, often controversial concept.
Absolutely. And again, it's crucial. The phallus is not the biological penis.
Right.
It's a signifier.
It's a privileged signifier within the symbolic order. It signifies lack and presence, potential jouissance, and most importantly, it's the signifier of the desire of the other.
What the other desires.
Yes, the phallus represents that elusive object that could hypothetically fulfill the other's desire, provide total satisfaction, total jouissance. It's a symbol of power. But a power rooted in lack, it signifies what's missing, what is desired.
And the sources say, paradoxically, that it is in order to be the phallus that a woman will reject an essential part of femininity. That sounds challenging. It is, and it's been heavily critiqued, as we'll see with Butler later. But from their perspective in the sources, it suggests a woman might position herself relative to the other's desire by trying to be what she imagines the other's desires to be the phallus.
Adopting a kind of masquerade.
Perhaps. Presenting herself as the desired object, even if it means rejecting aspects of her own subjectivity, that which she is not, that she wishes to be desired as well as loved. She seeks the signifier of her desire in the object, the man's body, which takes on the value of a fetish.
And the source adds something about frigidity versus repression.
Yes, it notes that while lack in sexual need frigidity is tolerated in women, the repression inherent in desire, tied to the symbolic, the phallus, is less evident than in men, suggesting a different relationship to desire and lack structured by the phallus as signifier.
Okay, so we have the imaginary, images, ego, misrecognition, the symbolic, language, law, lack, desire, phallus, castration. What about the third register, the real?
The real. This is perhaps the most difficult, the most elusive, precisely because its defining feature is that it resists symbolization. It resists being integrated into the symbolic order.
Can't be captured by language or images.
Exactly. It's the traumatic kernel at the core of subjectivity and the symbolic order itself. Not something outside human experience, but something within it that remains unassimilable.
So it's not like external reality, the physical world, or Kant's thing in itself.
No, it's distinct from the reality we construct via the imaginary and symbolic. The sources describe it as existing as bits of real, something that escapes the grasp of symbolization. It's associated with trauma, death, the death drive, that force pushing towards disintegration, repetition, beyond the pleasure principle.
It's not pleasant or meaningful.
It simply is. Raw, irreducible, defying symbolization.
And this relates to the thing, dusting, from earlier work, and later Objet.
Yes. Early Lacan used Freud's concept of das Ding. He described it as the beyond of the signified, unknowable, the truly lost object. But crucially, a lost object that was never there to be lost in the first place.
A vacuum around which desire forms.
Exactly. The object that causes desire, not the object that would satisfy it. Constituted retrospectively as something missing. Objectively speaking, no thing. Made something only by desire's search. Later, this evolved into Objet.
So what is Objet?
It's also linked to the real, but it's more specifically the object cause of desire. Not what you desire, but what makes you desire.
The remainder, the leftover bit.
Yes, the irreducible residue that slips away from full symbolization. The lack that drives the subject.
Yeah.
You can never fully attain it or represent it. It's precisely what escapes the symbolic grasp.
The source links us to Barthes' punctum in photography.
Exactly. That unexpected detail in a photo that pricks us, grabs attention, disrupts the conscious understanding studium. A raw encounter defying interpretation. That's like encountering the real as Objet.
And also to Marx's surplus value.
Yes, another fascinating link the source makes. Objet A is like surplus value, something produced within the system, labor, production, that escapes the full control or value assigned by the system. Profit, not returned to the labor, something left over, unaccounted for.
Surplus value, the punctum, the object cause of desire, all linked to this elusive object in the real.
Wow. And how does jouissance fit in?
Jouissance. Another key, notoriously complex concept, often contrasted with desire. Desire is the endless symbolic pursuit. Jouissance is something else.
Beyond pleasure.
Yes, described as being beyond pleasure. Often intense, maybe even painful, inaccessible, forbidden, linked to the death drive as an ultimate limit. The sources say we primarily experience it through its absence or inefficiency.
How so?
Because desire is insatiable, and achieving the object of desire only brings meager pleasure, temporary satisfaction. There's always a sense that there must be something more, a total ultimate satisfaction just out of reach, that something more is jouissance.
So we assume it's there because we're always dissatisfied. Yes. And we often fantasize about it, attribute this unfailing jouissance to the other. Imagine others experience satisfaction we're excluded from. But the source is clear, echoing Lacan. This unfailing jouissance does not exist. It's a fantasy driving our pursuit.
There's also mention of other jouissance, specifically related to the feminine structure.
Yes, a complex idea. The sources suggest a feminine structure might have a different, perhaps ineffable, relationship to this other jouissance. But the difficulty is you cannot actually say what it is.
Why not?
Because speech is tied to the symbolic, the phallic signifier. It can't fully capture it. If you could put it into words, it would fall under the phallic framework. This other jouissance is experienced but remains outside the grasp of language, unspeakable in the symbolic register.
And jouissance requires something to be paid to language, a debt, merlust.
Yeah, the concept of merlust or surplus jouissance. The idea is that entering the symbolic gaining language involves losing immediate pre-symbolic jouissance, but also opens up a different kind. The distance between jouissance and the body is only possible with the signifier.
The oyster beaver example in the source.
Right, illustrating that without the signifier, there's no such distance, implying no jouissance in the human symbolic sense. Jouissance is also said to be limited by natural processes, but the source questions if they're truly natural or just limit society the symbolic makes us accept, tied to the origin of the signifier.
Okay. Imaginary, images, ego. Symbolic, language, law, lack, desire. And the real. Resistance, trauma, objet, jouissance. Incredibly dense concepts, but they frame different dimensions of experience. How we appear, how it's structured symbolic, and what remains resistant, real. How do these ideas play out in actual psychoanalysis?
Lacan saw analysis as a very specific setting, a unique experience in its limited field, a science of the mirages that appear within that relationship. It's not about digging up some stable truth, but navigating the effects of language, desire, and the three registers in that context.
And transference is fundamental. How does Lacan see it?
Transference is that dynamic where the analysand relates to the analyst based on earlier patterns. The sources say the initial knot is often negative transference, linked to the imaginary transference of archaic images, rivalries from the mirror stage.
Okay.
Crucially, Lacan argues transference is a form of suggestion, but operating only on the basis of the demand for love, not simple need.
So the analysand isn't just asking for help like from a friend. They're addressing the analyst as the other who might finally provide recognition, love.
Exactly. Because the subject is constituted by the signifier, their fundamental demand is for recognition from the other. The sources criticize traditional analysts for misunderstanding this, reducing it back to simple needs. Any response, frustrating or gratifying, risks short-circuiting this core demand, bringing transference back to mere suggestion.
So what is the analyst's role then, if they aren't satisfying needs or the demand for love directly?
It's a delicate position. The sources say they are paradoxically not supposed to know much. Their role is to institute the analysand as the subject supposed to know.
The patient is the one supposed to know.
Right. Transference is founded on the analysand's belief that the analyst holds the key, but the analyst must preserve for the other the imaginary dimension of his non-mastery, of his necessary imperfection. Don't pretend to be the all-knowing other. Consolidate their own ignorance of each subject. The truth is in the analysand's discourse.
So the analyst facilitates the patient finding their own truth?
In a way. The sources mention a calculated vacillation of neutrality can sometimes be valuable for a hysteric, though it's risky.
And frustration in analysis, where does that come from, if not just the analyst being silent or difficult?
The sources make a crucial point. It's inherent in the very discourse of the subject. As the analysand speaks, explores, they engage in a growing dispossession of that being of his. They start recognizing their cherished sense of self, the ego identity, was always a construct in the imaginary, built like another, based on external identifications. And it's destined to disappoint because it's not the unconscious subject's truth. This labor of reconstructing their history for another reveals this fundamental alienation and lack, which is inherently frustrating.
That makes sense. The frustration comes from confronting your own illusions, not just the analyst. What about resistance?
Often confused with simple defense mechanisms. The first resistance analysis faces, according to the sources, is the discourse itself, specifically the discourse of opinion.
Our everyday narratives.
Exactly. Full of certainties, justifications, objectifications that maintain the imaginary illusion. This psychological objectification is bound up with opinion. Lacan criticized the Burgraves for stalling because they objectified patients too much, treating them as fixed cases, not fluid subjects of discourse. They got stuck at the ego level.
How does interpretation work in this framework, then, if it's not just telling the patient the meaning?
Interpretation intervenes in the signifier chain. Lacan suggests it can make a symptom disappear, the miracle of speech. A symptom is a symbol, written in the sand of the flesh. A signifier of a repressed signified.
Okay.
A strategic interpretation, operating where the subject is subordinated by the signifier, can cut into the established chain, allowing something new, the subject's truth, to emerge. The analytic session itself, especially the variable length one, can be a cut in a false discourse, interrupting the narrative.
But this power led to a guilty conscience.
Yes, the source notes analysts sometimes retreated, attributing cures to the patient's magical thinking, rather than the power of symbolic intervention.
So what's the ultimate goal, the end of analysis, not just a stronger ego?
No, it differs from traditional views, like identifying with the analyst's ego. For Lacan, the true end involves the subject confronting the constituting structure of his desire. By seeing how their desire was shaped in the same gap opened up by the effect of the signifiers in those who come to represent the other for him. It's not about becoming like the analyst. It's about understanding the structure of one's own desire, recognizing it's rooted in the lack within the other. The fact that the other, language itself, isn't complete.
Recognizing lack in oneself and the other.
Yes, which allows the subject to move differently in relation to desire.
Let's use some of Freud's famous cases referenced in our sources to make this more concrete, like the Wolfman.
Ah, the Wolfman. Classic Lacanian example used to illustrate nocturnally later dating or afterwardness.
How things get meaning later.
Exactly. Childhood events aren't just recorded linearly. They're restructured, reinterpreted, gain their traumatic meaning after the fact based on later experiences. Understanding is deferred. History isn't a simple timeline, but shaped by symbolic articulation.
And Freud's everyday example slips of the tongue, forgetting names.
Perfect illustrations. As we said, they show how every unsuccessful act is a successful discourse, revealing a hidden truth. The lapsus is where truth breaks through the gag that hinges on speech. Unconscious meaning emerges from language's structure, even its failures.
The butcher's beautiful wife dream. Lacan used that for hysteria.
Yes, a key example in the sources. It shows how the hysteric symbolizes non-satisfaction and promotes unsatisfied desire. Complex play of demand for love, the other's desire, Oedipus, castration. Ultimately, the analysis reveals the hysteric's reproach towards her mother for not giving her the phallus, a male sibling.
And the source adds a critique of Freud here.
Yes, suggesting Freud might have been better guided by the hysteric's performance of desire as a kind of truth, rather than relying solely on a fixed Oedipal interpretation.
And Dora's case.
Dora, Freud's famous unfinished analysis, is mentioned regarding Freud's own prejudices and difficulties. It highlights how the analyst's position, blind spots, countertransference affect the analysis.
Freud's misrecognition.
Right. The source points out Freud later recognized his reconnaissance regarding Dora's desire, which Lacan argued was aimed not just at men, but at a homosexual object, Frauke. Shows how the analyst's position influences what they hear.
Finally, Freud's own dream about his dead father. He did not know that he was dead.
A powerful dream Lacan uses to illustrate the subject-signifier relationship, the vacillation between enunciation, speaking, and statement, words. The line is chilling because of the split. The statement is he was dead. The enunciation includes the impossible idea he did not know. Shows the subject caught in language, fundamentally divided.
This is all incredibly dense, yes, but seeing it through these examples, it offers a profoundly different lens on experience, language, what drives us. Beyond the couch, how have these ideas spread?
Lacanian thought has had huge implications beyond analysis, influencing social and cultural theory widely. The idea that the social realm, like the subject, is structured by language and lack, an impossible object resisting full fixation. That's been very influential.
Who used these ideas?
Sources mention Yanis Stavrakakis applying Lacan to social theory and democracy, and Homi Bhabha using concepts like ambivalence and mimicry in post-colonial theory to analyze colonizer-colonized relations.
In film theory, too, the mirror stage connection. Our sources mention Screen and Baudry's apparatus theory.
Yes, absolutely. Huge influence in 70s psychoanalytic film theory. Baudry linked the cinema experience, darkroom, spectator immobility, projected image to the mirror stage. Arguing the spectator identifies not just with characters but with the camera, becoming the center of a unified visual world, recreating the mirror stage conditions, constructing the spectator as a subject within the apparatus, open to ideological interpolation. The primacy of the visual, suspension of mobility, echoes the infant state.
What about knowledge and science? How does Lacan view them?
Sources differentiate practical know-how from episteme purified philosophical knowledge. And There's the provocative idea that modern scientific discourse is currently on the side of the master, suggesting modern science operates with an internal logic that's hard to question from within. It produces knowledge, but resists being fully grasped by a knowing subject outside its framework.
Linked back to Hegel.
Yes. The result of the master-slave relation, in Lacan's reading, is object something that escapes capture. The source connects this again to Marx's surplus value, something created within the system that escapes the system's full valuation.
Okay, we've covered a vast landscape. Language, the decentered subject, the three registers, desire, jouissance, phallus, objet, the analytic encounter, Freudian cases, wider implications. But Lacan's work is controversial, right? Criticized.
Absolutely. Immensely influential, but not without detractors. The sources specifically provide Judith Butler's critique as a key example.
Butler's critique.
Yes, Butler, a philosopher deeply engaged with psychoanalysis, argues Lacan's account of the body, mirror stage, and the phallus as the central organizer of desire are fundamentally masculine, leading to a masculine epistemology, a way of knowing based on male experience.
How does she challenge the phallus's centrality?
Butler suggests its privileged status isn't inherent, but performatively produced it, quote, acquires its privileged status simply because we say it does, within a specific historical, heterosexualized, symbolic order. She challenges the idea of only one fundamental imaginary schema based on the male body image, and calls for recognizing alternative imaginary schemes, female, male, queer, etc., not subordinate to the phallic norm.
And she proposes the lesbian phallus.
Yes, a concept to disrupt heterosexual symbolism's dominance. The lesbian phallus isn't about a physical penis. It's a transferable fantasy, a mobile signifier of desire agency not tied to one body part or pairing.
So the phallus can be displaced.
Exactly. By suggesting it can function across different contexts, Butler aims to undermine its singular status, opening space for diverse desires and experiences, making the phallus merely one signifier among others, not the central one.
So her critique challenges the potential heteronormative, male-centered assumptions in Lacan's use of the phallus, opening up more inclusive ways to think about desire and subjectivity.
Precisely. It's a significant critique, highlighting how even theories aiming for universal structures can carry the imprint of their cultural context, especially regarding gender and sexuality.
This deep dive has definitely been intense. It asks us to think about language, the self, reality in fundamentally new ways. We've journeyed through Lacan's return to Freud, language shaping the subject, the three orders, imaginary, mirror, ego, symbolic, law, desire, phallus, real, ungraspable kernel, jouissance, objet. We've seen these in analysis, transference, resistance, interpretation via Freudian cases, and touched on wider implications and critiques.
Despite the initial density, engaging with these ideas really offers a powerful, unique lens. Understanding how language shapes us unconsciously, what drives our desires, how we're alienated from a stable self. This is definitely a deep dive into these sources, offering a curated path into Lacan's core concepts.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, as you go about your day, using language, pursuing desires, encountering things that feel real but inexplicable? If, as Lacan suggests, desire is fundamentally eccentric, insatiable, born in that gap between need and demand, what does this imply about our lifelong search for satisfaction? If no object can truly fill that gap, where do we find peace? And what role does language play in both creating that gap and maybe offering temporary ways to navigate it?
And thinking about the real, that which resists symbolization, the unknowable kernel outside language and the imaginary,
Yeah.
what does this tell us about the limits of knowledge? The limits of language in grasping the full truth of our existence, or the truth of trauma, the uncanny, the aspects of life that just defy explanation.
These are big, lingering questions Lacan's work leaves us with. Questions to keep pondering long after this deep dive is over. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these ideas in your own thinking.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.